Welcome to session 1 of this course on the work of Carl Jung, which is session 1 of 14. And if you are watching this on YouTube, that means it is one of the 2 free sessions that are publicly available to give you basically a taster as to whether or not this full course is for you and basically what the course entails. But let's basically jump in. For those of you that are part of the full course, you will have watched the introduction. You will have understood what approach I am taking to the work of Carl Jung and what approach in general I am taking in this course. So without further ado, we begin with session 1, Jung's vision, the architecture of the psyche. So, and I am going to have to move my camera around a fair bit during these talks, but there we go. So what we're going to do over these 10 sessions, the first 10 sessions being the sort of journey where you can, engage in the practical work and the exercises that I've put in the workbook. What we're going to do in these 10 sessions is not just study Jung's ideas academically. We're going to try work with them, we're going to try apply them, and basically we're going to try allow them to transform our understanding of ourselves. Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." So this course, in a sense, is about awakening. I don't want to fully stifle Jung's work into a theory that is kind of just on paper, and you end up understanding, say, the ideas, whatever they might be, the shadow, the anima, the animus, but you still don't really have that ability to kind of bridge them through to felt, lived experience. And something to really emphasize with Jung, and we see this all throughout his work, mentioned explicitly at times, is that this is a living work. Symbols for him are living. The psyche and the self is in flux. This is a living thing that you can't just grasp and extract one idea and kind of work with it in safety. And so I want to, and I'm going to, and we're going to approach Jung's work in this sense, in the mysterious sense, because Jung does not shy away from mystery. And in that sense, it's a becoming basically conscious of forces within us that have been operating in the dark. But this isn't a belief system. Jung's work is not a belief system. You don't have to believe in the unconscious the way you might believe in God with regard to a religion. Okay. Instead, I think it's best to think of Jung's concepts as maps, as ways to navigate and understand what is going on in terms of feelings, forces, symbols. Their value lies in whether they basically help you navigate the territory you're already in. Do they help you navigate the problems of your life, the turbulence that's going on within your life, within the world, within your relation to the world, within your psyche? Your own experience is really the ultimate arbiter of whether or not any of this is useful. And this first session, the architecture of the psyche, is going to be laying the foundation. We're going to explore Jung's basic vision of how the psyche is structured, how it operates, and what basically the fundamental purpose of the psyche is for Jung. Now, this might seem abstract, but I promise you by the end, we're going to have all the tools we need, and we're going to have a lot of terms and a lot of places that we can then draw in to further lectures. But as you'll see from this first slide, actually the place to really begin is Jung's break from Freud. So very, very briefly, I haven't done a biography lecture in this course because I don't feel it's needed when we're really trying to actually integrate Jung's teachings into ourselves, into how to actually living the Jungian life. Okay, so there's no biography, but very, very quickly, to understand Jung, we need to understand where he came from and what he rejected. So Carl Gustav Jung, born in Switzerland in 1875, the son of a Protestant pastor, he trained as a psychiatrist and became one of Sigmund Freud's most promising disciples, and there they are in one of the few pictures of them together. And for several years, Freud saw Jung, and this is very well known, and in the bibliography there is recommended biographies, but for several years Freud saw Jung as his heir apparent, basically the prince in a way of psychoanalysis, and really like the guy who's going to carry this project forward into the future. But Jung couldn't stay in that role, okay? Jung couldn't stay where kind of Freud desired him ultimately to stay. And the break between the two of them is pretty clear-cut in the history. There doesn't seem to be much disagreement with scholars about where and when this happens. It's basically 1913 in a letter. And if anyone's interested in reading Jung's collected works, Symbols of Transformation, which is retitled later on, but now called Symbols of Transformation from that year, is the place where Jung becomes Jung proper, we could say. And the break between the two of them comes over fundamental disagreements about the nature of the unconscious and the driving forces of human psychology. So where Freud, and of course this is a very short introduction in its sense between their break and Freud, but where Freud saw the unconscious primarily as a repository of repressed sexual and aggressive impulses, a kind of psychic sewer where we dump everything civilization won't allow us to express. For Freud, the unconscious was essentially backward-looking, formed by our own personal history, particularly childhood experiences. And the goal of analysis was to make the unconscious conscious, to drain all this kind of sewerage out and really get us back to this held civilizational, arguably nowadays patriarchal ego, so to speak, and bring the contents of this under the control of the rational ego. Now, Jung finds this vision basically too narrow, too reductive, and ultimately too pessimistic. Yes, he agrees and agreed that the unconscious contains repressed personal material. But for Jung, that's not all it contains, not even close, as we'll see throughout the whole course. For Jung, the unconscious wasn't just a sort of garbage dump to be worked out, to be rationalized, to be drawn back into the middle point, the equilibrium between id and superego. For Jung, it's also a source of creativity, of wisdom, of potential, of future development. It wasn't just personal, it was also collective, containing patterns and potentials shared by all humanity, basically. And so this reconceptualization is put very, very simply that Freud posits a backward-looking repository of repressed material, and Jung reframes this. He reframes the unconscious as a forward-looking source of archetypal meaning, imbued with growth, wisdom, and creativity. Very relational. Okay. And the divergence gives rise really to two distinct trajectories. Psychoanalysis, oriented towards symptom relief, we could say. Now, this is all very retrospective. And then analytical psychology, which is oriented toward the emergence of the self and the integration of meaning. There is a massive overlap between the two, but they have distinctly become their own things. So, moving forward from the divergence from Freud, we begin by actually contrasting these two unconscious models. We kind of want to put Freud and Jung a bit more side by side. Okay, so Freud's emphasis, as I've said, is kind of on repressed drives. Okay, in the Freudian sort of iceberg, the submerged mass is primarily sexual and aggressive, and they've been pushed out of the consciousness through defensive mechanisms. These are things that do not fit in that sort of Freudian, patriarchal, quite tight civilizational society, basically. You know, these things have to be repressed as a defense. Whereas Jung's iceberg, for instance, expands to include not only personal memories, but a deeper transpersonal sort of stratum, which we will come to fully understand, the collective unconscious, which is populated by timeless archetypal motifs and the archetypes. Now, this is kind of the crucial insight of all of psychoanalysis, that beneath our personal unconscious lies something deeper. For Jung. This is the key insight for Jung, that moving from just the personal unconscious, which is just those repressed memories, repressed ideas, the repressed sexual and aggressive instincts, and this problem to do with what to do with that's coming from perhaps the superego or the id and mediating it. Well, the crucial insight for Jung is that there's something deeper than the personal unconscious, which is called the collective unconscious. And this isn't mysticism. It's kind of the psychological equivalent of our biological inheritance. Just as we inherit bodies with certain maybe heart defects or certain visual things or certain structures, we also inherit psyches with certain structures, what Jung would call archetypes. And going back to the break, it basically does become inevitable. And because in 1913, the relationship ruptures, Jung enters into what he calls his confrontation with the unconscious. And this is a period of intense psychological turmoil for him, during which he experiences visions, he hears voices, he feels himself to be on the edge of psychosis. Anyone who's read the biography of Jung will know this is a man who had an intense living relationship to psychological realities. But instead of, what does he do? Instead of running, which in a sense we could say the backward-looking Freudian approach, instead of running from these experiences, Jung engages with them. He records all these visions in what would become the Red Book. He paints, he sculpts, he does the mandalas, he dialogues with the figures that emerge from his unconscious. And this wasn't a breakdown. This isn't backward looking. It was a breakthrough. It was forward looking. And from this kind of bearing the cross, from this crucible, comes Jung's mature psychology that takes the unconscious seriously on its own terms and is not pigeonholing it towards something as pessimistic as Freud, which is just trying to condense a sort of tragic worldview down to just an everyday misery, as Freud says himself. So this doesn't just see symptoms not just as like a pathology to be rationalized so you can get back to the business of being just a comfortable ego in civilization. This is meaningful communication, creative communication from depths within us. And so really try to keep in mind retrospective Freud versus prospective for Jung. Jung is optimistic, he's hopeful, he's courageous, he's ultimately creative. Okay, there is a creativity in this mapping of the psyche. And what does this result in when it comes to therapeutic aims? It's kind of illumination versus relationship, where the Freudian goal, making the unconscious conscious, kind of just reduces the psychic tension. But the Jungian goal is an ongoing cultivation of a relationship with the unconscious to foster individuation. Okay? So, what does this look like when we actually look at ourselves? What's going on in the map, our first map here really, of the psyche? So basically, I'm going to try to put this as structurally simple as possible, but there's a couple of caveats before going forward, which is Jung is, as far as I'm concerned, as I've already said, it's a living work. Jung's work is living. It's vital. It's prospective. It's forward-looking. It's creative, but it's also kind of holistic. You know, so when I speak here of the architectural map of the psyche or the structure of the psyche, you might get in your mind this idea of like, if you could zoom into it, like literally somehow you go, oh, there's the conscious, there's the personal unconscious, there's the collective unconsciousness, there's the persona, very sort of like rigid. It is absolutely not rigid. It is all intermingling, interflowing, and it's living. So it has this relationality, and that's something to bear in mind. So, how did Jung understand the structure of our psyches? Well, these bullet points refer to a map, which we will look at soon. I will go back and forward between these. So, Firstly, at the center of consciousness sits the ego. We'll come back to these actually, and we'll begin here. So at the center of consciousness sits the ego. Okay, this is not Freud's ego. It's not some sort of embattled sort of executive trying to just mediate between id and superego. The ego is simply the I, the sense of continuous identity and ability to say, I think, I feel, I remember. It's our conscious personality, our sense of ourselves as a subject. That is what the ego is. You can see it. So you can see that at the top of the structure there, it is in what is conscious. We are conscious of that. I can say, I think, I feel, I'm conscious of that. It's necessary. It's valuable. Okay. There isn't this kind of degradation of these things here. Without it, we'd have no coherence. We'd have no ability to function in the world because we would not have that continuity of identity. But the ego is not the center of the psyche as a whole. It's the center of consciousness, but consciousness is just one part of a much larger system, as you can already see. So Jung compares the ego to a cork floating on the vast ocean of the unconscious. The ego likes to think it's in charge, that it's the captain of the ship, but really it's subject to currents and forces it barely understands. Just below this, as you can see in a sort of bar-like thing there, the threshold of consciousness, which is the personal unconscious. So we're moving sort of metaphorically or visually down, and we talk about the depths of the collective unconscious. It's a good way to think about it. So, the ego and the persona, which we'll get to, is like on top. It's everything that's up and is conscious. And we're moving down. So we're beginning to move down into the personal unconscious. So just below the threshold of consciousness, of what we're conscious of, lies what Jung calls the personal unconscious. This is closer to what Freud had in mind. It contains everything we've experienced but aren't currently conscious of. Memories, both accessible and forgotten, repressed desires, fears, complexes, which we'll talk about in session 5. Everything we've learned and absorbed that's not currently in conscious awareness is here. Now, the personal unconscious is formed by our, yours, or mine individual life experience. It's unique to you. Now, this is important to bear in mind because when we get to the collective unconscious, there isn't that individual aspect as much. So it's unique to us. It's unique to the individual. The person who grew up in poverty has a different personal unconscious than the person who grew up wealthy. The traumatized childhood has a different unconscious contents, personal unconscious contents, than the person who had secure attachment, for instance. So material from the personal unconscious can become conscious relatively easily. You can remember things if we try. Dreams often draw from this layer, and therapy typically works at this level, bringing unconscious personal material into awareness. Now, if I was to be a bit harsher on that Freud-Jung split, we could say this is where like Freud is kind of keeping us. He's just trying to use this to just get a mediation of that ego so it can just get by in society without a sort of pathology. But this is, really what Jung considered his most important discovery, which is below the personal unconscious. As you can see just to the left lies something called the collective unconscious. This is not personal. It's not formed by our individual experience. It's inherited, not learned, but built into the structure of the psyche itself. Think of it this way. When a bird builds its nest for the first time, where does that knowledge come from? It's instinctual, it's inherited, it's not learned. The pattern of nest building is written into the bird's biology. Similarly, Jung argued, certain psychological patterns are written into human nature. So the collective unconscious contains what Jung called archetypes, which are universal patterns of experience, potential ways and forms and understandings of being human. Kind of put a capital letter onto all of these as archetypes. The mother, the father, the child, the trickster, the wise old man. the hero's journey, which is a process. These aren't just literary themes or cultural constructs. They're deep structures inherent in the psyche itself, patterns that repeat across cultures and throughout history because they reflect something fundamental about human nature. Now, we'll explore archetypes in detail in session 6. For now, what's important to understand is that Jung sees the psyche as having layers: personal and collective, conscious and unconscious. Okay. Now, you will notice, we will get to the other ones, but you will notice something that isn't as often mentioned in Jung. You don't hear about it as often, which is if you look just below the personal unconscious in this image, not the shadow, not the soul image, but beneath that, the mana or the mana personality. Now, this does have a relationship to archetypal imagery and archetypal sort of ways. So this is, the mana personality is a personified archetypal image of a supernatural force. The mana personality, it's kind of a dominant of the collective unconscious, which I've just mentioned. For instance, it might be like the dominant, well-known archetype of the mighty man, for instance, in the form of hero, chief, or a magician, or a saint. So the mana personality evolves into the hero. So this is just a specific understanding, personification of an archetypal image as a direct relationship with the collective unconscious. Now, looking at these the other parts, some of which, so the shadow and the persona, we're going to go into specific talks on them, and the soul image will come up later. But you will also notice that, much like the yin-yang symbol, people often, they focus on the black with the white spot in it and then the white with the black spot in it. There's a third part to that, which is the ring around the whole thing, and people often overlook that. And so you'll notice here, well, there's a huge word, self. Where's that? It's a whole thing. Now, this can be confusing because what Jung called the self is often what we say when we mean self, which for Jung would be the ego. But Jung's self, usually capitalized, is not the ego. It's not your conscious sense of I. Rather, it's the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective, ego and everything beyond ego. But there's a kind of a mystery to the self because it's also the organizing center of the psyche, which for Jung, by the way, is self-regulating. So when I spoke earlier about the holism, about the holistic nature, about the living, the liveness and the vitality of it, the self is, symbolically speaking, a circle drawn around everything in the psyche, that then we can say that's where the self-regulation is taking place. So the self is the organizing center of the psyche, the principle that tries to bring all the parts into relationship to create wholeness, self-regulation, equilibrium, balance. Jung sometimes actually called it the God image within, not because it's literally divine, though some could easily argue that, but because it functions like what religious people mean by the divine. It's the source of meaning. It's the self-regulatory purpose, direction, and unity. And in a sense, and we'll go through these. I just want to really drill these down. So I've got a few more slides on each specifically when we go through them. The relationship between ego, just staying with the self, the relationship between ego, so I think, I am, the continuous identity, and self is crucial. Because the ego, as per Freud's kind of drive, the ego needs to be strong enough to function in the world, but also it needs to be humble enough to recognize it's not the whole story. So when the ego thinks it's everything, we get inflation, we get hubris, we get psychological rigidity. When the ego is too weak, however, we get possession by unconscious forces. We are unable to function and we fragment. So the goal of psychological development relates back to this relationship between ego and self. So self, everything, what is going on in the self-regulation, funneled through in a way to the ego, which is the sort of front-facing continuous identity. And the goal then of psychological development relates to this, which is the goal for Jung called individuation, which I have a whole session on. It's not to strengthen the ego at the expense of everything else, but to establish the right relationship between ego and self. We'll see more of that in session 8. But we've got these parts, and I'll quickly mention the other ones. So beginning at the top, we've got ego, continuous sense. I think, I am doing this. We've got self, which is everything. So ego, I think, I am, continuous identity. Persona, these are the masks we wear in certain situations. We might have a different persona or mask for our job, a different one at home with our family, a different one when we're by ourselves. We'll look at those in the persona session. Ego and persona are conscious. Then we go down to the personal unconscious, which is individual, unique, because they're individual from our life experiences, repressed ideas, repressed memories, repressed thoughts, and things that just aren't conscious right now. Then when things become more deeply unconscious, we could say, we have the collective unconscious inherent in the psyche. Now, within that, we have the shadow, which is kind of the inverted opposite dark forces of ourselves. It's a bit rough and ready right now. And then the archetypes from the collective unconscious can come through to our personal unconscious. And we also have the soul image and the man of personality, which we'll get to later on. Now, all of that is encapsulated within, symbolically again, the self, the capital S self, which is a self-regulating system. Now, we just go through and basically hone in on each one of these parts before we get to the self as the self-regulating system. So personal unconscious, the private archive of experience, and the composition from lived events. Every encounter, as we know, this is all our personal individual experience. All our encounters, all our trauma or pleasure inscribes a trace within the personal unconscious. This is our private repository of affect-laden impressions. Now, these clusters of these memories, especially traumatic memories, coalesce into what are known as complexes, which we'll go to in the session called the complex, which become sort of pathologies, but they become semi-autonomous psychic structures that trigger reflexive patterns. So you can begin to try and map this all together, if you like. Now, there's a potential through the personal unconscious for retrieval from free association, that's talk therapy, from dream work, from active imagination. And from these methodologies, the contents of the personal unconscious can surface into awareness for integration. Even for those that are following along with the workbook, the dream diary is one that the longer you keep that, the more you get a depth of understanding of what might be going on there. But equally, free association and free writing is the alternative pattern there. So this is a conscious retrieval from the personal unconscious. And then and what's happening when they're retrieved is, well, the ego negotiates with these contents, really. It suppresses them, might see them as a threat, but it also might rely on them for creativity and how to adapt to certain situations. Hence, the creation of complexes comes from adaptive responses in a certain sense. From this, the ego, which is then sort of dealing with these things, and psychoanalysis is the conscious dealing with the unconscious. And one thing to always remember about psychoanalysis is really we think and we believe ourselves to be existing and acting primarily from consciousness because we're apparently conscious all the time. But the point really that all psychoanalysts will emphasize is that we're primarily working from the unconscious. And it's the ego and the conscious awareness that does believe it's the captain, the sort of provisional captain of the ship, that has to adapt, has to try create something from this to really mediate itself into world. And so the identity that we find is an emergent narrative that, we have a continuity, and it enables the individual, the ego enables the individual to locate ourselves. I am here, I am James, I'm recording this course for you. But this is a positionality within conscious experience. And the ego is not just the totality of the psyche, even though it thinks it is. It occupies a very limited zone of influence within the broader unconscious field. And that's something to really hone in on as one goes about their day, that what is it that might be in charge? What thoughts or what maybe is bubbling up or bubbling under the surface, or what imagery may be triggering certain things within the apparent, triggering the apparent captain. And so the ego's authority then is permeable. It can be overridden by a charged unconscious material. There might suddenly be a symbolic imagery that just bypasses everything, and we have some adaptive response that we don't fully understand. And that takes us back to the metaphor of the cork, of buoyancy, of vulnerability. So the ego remains afloat through conscious effort, but it can quickly be submerged with the surrounding unconscious currents that, if they become too turbulent, and manage to break through. And that then takes us through to a further discussion on the collective unconscious. So that was the what effect the personal unconscious might have on the ego. Well, the collective unconscious, in housing these pre-existing evolutionary inherited psychic forms that shape the way that all of us perceive, feel, and act across cultures. So these will equally have this archetypal genealogy of humanity will equally have an affect that's coming through the ego that it has to navigate. And these are recurring symbolic patterns that might be sort of projected onto people or things or processes that we're going through. The mother, the hero, the shadow, these surface up in myth and art, and we become affected by great literature and great art. And they function akin to sort of psychic instincts, these sort of archetypal currents that, remember, are part of the unconscious and part of the collective unconscious, operate as instinctual forces for the psyche, guiding sort of effective orientation, motivation, and meaning-making without conscious deliberation. Why is this journey taking the path it is? And this is sort of a non-personal genesis, because they're not derived from individual experience. They appear in disparate societies with striking similarity. So they underscore that notion of collectivity. And then finally back to the center, which will bring us back to further talk on, well, all of this is happening. And I understand that I've overlooked persona and shadow, which are a bit more detailed as we're just getting the structure of the whole. There are separate talks on those, as you've seen. But the self as the integrative center, who is holding all of this together? Because to repeat, and it has to be really drilled in and understood, Jung did not see the psyche as a static structure. He saw it as a living, dynamic, self-regulating system, kind of like a biological organism that naturally seeks balance and health. And so the self, the totality encompassing conscious and unconscious, or everything, is the overarching unity that includes every stratum. Okay, it forms the coherent psychic whole. It forms that balance that even might be manic, but it's sort of there as a protective measure. And so the organizing principle of individuation is the self, the central compass, directing developmental sort of trajectory towards differentiation, integration, and self-realization. As Jung said, it's the God image. Okay, the self is the inner archetype, the sacred nucleus that mirrors everything to get this dynamic balance. The self mediates the tension between present identity, future potential. Okay? And this brings us, to the big point. The psyche as self-regulating system. And this is why, for those doing the workbook, I have included the soul mirror exercise, which I talked through the exercises and all the workbook stuff in the practice talk, which is its own thing. But the soul mirror in the sense of balancing, in the sense of positive, negative, in the sense of correlating opposites and positive and negative traits to understand the notion of balance within the system, and really trying to bring that up and put it down on paper to see imbalances. What is a self-regulating system if not that which seeks balance and therefore can sort of warning signs of this is imbalance. Maybe you're emotionally imbalanced, maybe you're intellectually imbalanced. And for me, that practice is one of the greats for that. But the psyche then, as a self-regulating system, it's dynamic equilibrium. It's seeking wholeness. It operates as that adaptive system that continuously strives to restore balance between conscious aspirations and unconscious demands, unconscious ruptures, symbolic sort of invasions even. And this compensatory mechanism, and we'll get to compensation a bit more in depth, is counterbalancing one-sided consciousness. So when the ego over-identifies with a single attitude, ego, remember that continuous identity, when it over-identifies with a single attitude, maybe it's like, I'm going to be rational, the unconscious will generate countersigns. It will throw in dreams. It will throw in symbols to re-establish that dynamic symmetry. And this is where, really, when we think about the prospective function that is projecting future potentials, think back to the split between Freud and Jung, we're not just reconciling past trauma. The unconscious is in that self-regulating mechanism, offering us teleological, regulatory hints toward possible pathways. It's hopeful. So symptoms don't simply become this thing to just be mediated and solved so you can get back to the business of Freudian misery. They become communicative signals. They're not merely dysfunctions. They convey meaningful messages from the unconscious, urging conscious attention and integration. It's a hopeful, creative message. Now, compensation. And I have to pull myself away from the image of Jung himself. I don't want to be too grandiose. So compensation. So the key concept, of course, for some form of regulation or self-regulation of the psyche is compensation. The unconscious compensates for the one-sidedness of consciousness. If your conscious attitude is too rigid in one direction, the unconscious will push it in the opposite direction to restore balance. An example would be, say you consciously identify as a purely rational, logical person. You pride yourself on being reasonable, scientific, controlled. You dismiss emotion as weakness. You've built your whole identity, ego, around being the rational one. Well, what happens? Your unconscious will compensate. You might have intensely emotional, even irrational dreams. You might be prone to sudden outbursts of feeling that seem to come from nowhere. You might fall or fail helplessly, irrationally in love with someone completely inappropriate because the unconscious is trying to balance you out, trying to force you to acknowledge the emotional dimension you've repressed. Or let's take another example. Consider someone who's overly nice, who can never say no, who's always accommodating others' needs. Their unconscious will be full of rage, be full of aggression, even sadistic fantasies, because they're secretly a bad person. But because the psyche needs the full spectrum of human, not because they're secretly a bad person, but because the psyche needs the full spectrum of human possibility. If consciousness won't allow, if the conscious reaction to the world won't allow anger, the unconscious will hold it, and often in exaggerated, primitive form. So when you're, instead of, if you're super, super nice and there's a sort of justified, legitimate time to be angry, that energy doesn't just disappear. It's pushed down and has to transform. Here you go. Here's your horrific desire. Here's your horrific dream. And that's why Jung insisted that symptoms are meaningful. A phobia, a compulsion, an anxiety attack, these aren't just random malfunctions. They're communications from the unconscious. It's telling you something. It's telling you you've got an imbalance. Attempts by the psyche, by the whole system, to restore balance, to force consciousness to pay attention to something it's been ignoring. But this also brings us back. This brings us back again to the difference between Freud and Jung, and to forward-looking for Jung and arguably backward looking for Freud, which is the prospective function. And I also am going to have to move myself over a painting, but I'll keep myself over there just for now. So we also have the prospective function. So we have the sort of compensatory function, which the compensation for Freud would make sense. Here's this dysfunction, there's a compensation, mediates, ego's doing fine in civilization and society, we're all fine. Well, Freud looked backwards, what early trauma caused this symptom. Jung looked backward too, of course, still there, the personal unconscious is still something to be dealt with, but also he looked forward. He knows that dreams and symptoms often pointed ahead, toward potential, toward development, towards what the person might become. So he called this the prospective function of the unconscious. It's not just showing you the past, it's showing you possibilities for the future. A dream might anticipate a life change before you're consciously aware that you need to make it. A symptom might be pushing you toward growth you're resisting consciously. And this is a radically different way of thinking about psychological suffering. Instead of seeing suffering as purely pathological, something just to be eliminated, just a dysregulation to get rid of it, and then we'll get on with our day, Jung saw suffering as potentially meaningful, even purposive. The psyche might be making you suffer because it's trying to get your attention to push you towards, hey, you need to develop. You're imbalanced. You need to develop in that direction. Now, let me be clear, right? Doesn't mean all suffering is good or should be embraced, right? Jung doesn't mean that. Some suffering is just suffering, the result of trauma, bad luck, biochemical imbalance, and even meaningful suffering is still suffering. But asking, what is this symptom trying to tell me? Or where is this anxiety trying to push me? Is productive. You're not just trying to get rid of it. You're saying, well, hang on, what's the meaning? So it treats the psyche as an ally, not an enemy. And the ways in which we could see this, specifically with dreams as forward-looking guides, you can say that with dream imagery, symbolic motifs in dream will foreshadow forthcoming life stages. A journey across water might be an upcoming major transition. Okay, physical or psychic symptoms that arise without obvious cause can be interpreted as unconscious alert points for imminent change. And this means that we begin to become interpretive, okay, instead of just backward looking, rather than reading dreams solely just as this regressive recollection that's always in the past. The analyst from analytical psychology would adopt, well, what could a delving into this symbol that's bubbled up unlock? Okay, and this means that we cultivate an awareness. We begin to review dreams with an awareness for potential. Now, this then means my notes are going all over the place. This leads us to sort of a very quick discussion on methods of engaging the unconscious and energy with regard to this, and then we'll go through to one of the first discussions on the four functions, and then there's going to be even more discussion on the four functions, because not only do they play a big role in Jung in terms of trying to map yourself, but they also play a role in the work practices that I've put forth. But Jung thought of psychic energy, that he called it libido or libido energy, that is far broader than Freud's sort of sexual libido energy. Jung thought of psychic energy as flowing between opposites, and you see a lot of opposites already, okay? Conscious and unconscious, thinking and feeling, activity and rest, balance, right? So the psyche's always seeking balance, always trying to distribute energy where it's needed. And when energy gets stuck, when it's all flowing in one direction, right? Think back to compensation, or blocked, you get symptoms. It's a warning sign, but it's to do with this energy, really. Depression, for instance, involves a massive withdrawal of energy from conscious life. But where's it gone? It doesn't just disappear. It's gone into the unconscious. Why? Well, perhaps because conscious life has become sterile, meaningless, disconnected from deeper sources of value. The energy has withdrawn into the unconscious like a hibernating animal. waiting for better conditions. The goal isn't to force energy back into old patterns, but to understand why it withdrew and what new patterns might be needed for it to flow again. And what do these methods for engaging this look like? Well, dream journal is one of the key ones. Active imagination, which is I've written about in the workbook. Deliberately entering something like a trance-like state to converse with inner figures, which can also be done with automatic writing. There's also synchronicity, which we get to much later, and creative output, artistic, literary, musical expression. All of this is a form of engagement with the unconscious when you're attending to it with this openness, and primarily begin with the dream journaling and also the soul mirror exercise. Now, we've also, as I said, we're going to look at the functions here. So, because these are very key before going forward with the whole course to really understand also the practices, and they fit quite neatly with what we've been talking about, which is structure. And so, we've 4 functions, and we have 4 elements. And before I go right through to the end with more practical application, this framework has to be introduced as far as I'm concerned. It becomes far more central in session 9, but that's a way down the road. And these are things that all throughout the practical side of the course can be mapped in a very productive sense. Okay, so because what we're talking about is observing our psyche. We're talking, there's the structure of the psyche. There are the basic components, and we'll go into the ones I've overlooked here deeper in their specific talks. But there it is. Well, this is what I want to do with this course: is how to engage this. What do I do? How do I really begin to observe this? And Jung's theory of the 4 psychological functions and their relationship to the 4 elements, I think, is superb for this, because it gives you a preliminary map of how consciousness operates, how we actually apprehend and judge reality differently, and why certain aspects of experience feel natural to us as individuals, but why others might feel foreign or underdeveloped. So this does also, it connects everything in Jung, connects to everything else in Jung, but this also connects to Jung's psychology of ancient symbolic systems and a continuity between modern insight and perennial wisdom. So the 4 functions, which are ways of engaging reality, really. So Jung sees this. He sees that, people engage reality through 4 distinct functions. These aren't personality types. Everyone uses all 4 of these psychological functions, but we use them in hierarchy. Some are dominant, highly developed, natural. Others are inferior, underdeveloped, primitive. And the 4 functions divide into 2 pairs. Thinking, that is logic, objective principles, cause and effect, what's true. These are the rational functions, judging. And then the other pair, the irrational functions, perceiving, sensation, and intuition. So irrational doesn't mean crazy or illogical. It means non-rational, not based in judgment or evaluation, but in perception, apprehension. So let me go into these. So we have thinking. We have the rational functions first. So the pair of the rational functions, which are thinking and feeling, logic and objective principles, basically. So the thinking function operates through logic, analysis, objective principles, cause and effect. When you're using thinking, you ask, what's true? What's logical? What are the principles here? What makes sense objectively? Thinking is about classification. It's about categorization. It's about systematic understanding. It values consistency, fairness, competence. It prioritizes truth over harmony, logic over accommodation. Okay, a thinking type, then, someone whose dominant function is thinking, might say, I don't care if it hurts your feelings. It's objectively true. This can seem cold, but it's not lack of caring. It's the prioritization of these functions over the other pair. Okay, so thinking doesn't mean smart, though. Plenty of highly intelligent people are feeling types. It's a mode of operating, not an achievement level. Okay, And thinking types can reach illogical conclusions by applying logic incorrectly. Okay? Now, you might be beginning to see why in the workbook with the soul mirror, I mapped these to the soul mirror exercise from Bardon, which I consider just one of the best exercises for understanding yourself that has ever been made. And it's so simple. But these map, you might be beginning to sort of see yourself in these certain traits. So thinking, classification, categorization, when you have both positive and negative, you might say, well, I'm someone who I'm really good at putting something in the right place systematically. But then you might also have a negative aspect of this where, I go out in nature and I don't see the trees anymore because I'm classifying everything. So both of these can apply, and you might end up, what the point of that exercise is, after a couple of weeks, you might see on the negative side, I've got an abundance of negative aspect thinking traits, like beyond anything I even saw. And this will begin to reveal to you a lot about yourself. Anyway, just a nod to the exercises. The other function of the rational functions, feeling. So the feeling function operates through values, it operates through personal significance and impact. When using feeling, you might ask, what matters here? What do I value? How does this affect people? What's the right thing given the values of the situation? Feeling is about value judgments. It's about good and bad. It's about important and unimportant. It's based on personal and interpersonal criteria. Okay, and a feeling type might say, I know the policy says X, but in this situation with this person, actually we should do Y. This isn't illogical. It's a prioritization of values and human impact. Okay, and again, feeling doesn't mean emotional in the sense of reactive or moody. It means valuing, making judgments based on what matters, okay? Which then brings us through to the seeming irrational functions of perception, sensation, and intuition. Now, the sensation function perceives through 5 senses, focused on concrete reality. What is present? What is actual? And when using this, you could ask questions again. What are the facts? What's actually here? What can I see? What can I hear? What can I smell? This is about present reality. It's about practical application. It's about step-by-step processes. It trusts the tangible. A sensation type is grounded. They're detail-oriented. They make great craftspeople. But the weakness is that you can become quite unimaginative because you only have what's present. They don't naturally deal with possibilities or meanings or abstract patterns. They're focused on what is, not what might be. Leads us to intuition, and the intuition function perceives possibilities, patterns again, meanings, future potentials. The questions the intuition function would ask are, what might this become? What's the pattern here? What are the implications? What's possible? Intuition is about the future. It's about seeing connections. It's about meanings and patterns, visions and innovation. It's imaginative. The intuitive type is a visionary. They're innovative, they're a researcher, they're an entrepreneur. But what's the weakness? Everything has its bounds, as we're seeing. The weakness is they can seem impractical, unrealistic, disconnected from the concrete reality. So you're starting to see that everything in Jung's system has that regulatory aspect of self-regulation. Now, the crucial point is that everyone uses all 4 functions, but in hierarchy. So you have a dominant function, most developed and most comfortable, your go-to way of operating. You have an auxiliary function, second most developed, which supports the dominant. You have a tertiary function, less developed, merges in adulthood, and then an inferior function, least developed, largely unconscious, primitive when it emerges. You might begin to develop some insight into where each function fits. And here's the rule. Your dominant and inferior functions are always opposites. So if thinking is your dominant function, feeling is inferior. If sensation is dominant, intuition is inferior. Why? Because developing one function necessitates, as we've already seen, neglecting its opposite. You can't simultaneously focus on concrete facts, sensation, and abstract possibilities, intuition. You can't prioritize logic and feeling. Life forces choices. Your life circumstances, your family, your temperament pushed you to develop certain functions. The ones you developed became dominant, the ones you neglected became inferior. And they didn't go away. They're tucked away. Guess where? In your unconscious. Not, they're primitive, they're undeveloped, but they're alive and they can be worked with, okay, and cared for. But this is where it gets interesting, and this is where those of you that have the deeper interest in alchemy, in occultism, in symbology, when you're doing the soul mirror exercise, you can really go in depth here, because you can say not only is there a predominance of feeling, there's a predominance of water, which then just expands your symbolic understanding of yourself unfathomably, okay? Jung noticed that these four functions, intuition, feeling, thinking, sensation, correspond remarkably to the classical four elements: fire, water, air, earth. This is not arbitrary. The elements are symbolic. They're living symbols describing fundamental modes of being. Okay? So Jung's functions are modern psychological language for the same underlying realities that then can begin to be mapped. Okay? So intuition. Okay, let's say like you're working on your soul mirror and you've noticed you've got, you've got a predominance of intuition in some place. This maps to the alchemical and elemental symbol of fire. It's energy, it's passion, it's vision, it's inspiration, it's transformation. Okay, psychologically it's fiery, it leaps to face the possibility, it sees visions, it burns with insight. But too much fire, burnout, scattered energy, no grounding. Too little fire, you're dull. You're unable to envision a future. You're stuck. Okay? And each of these, of course, has these opposites. And I'll go through them. Feeling. Feeling maps to water. Water is emotion, it's flow, it's depth, the unconscious dissolution of boundaries, it's connection, it's merging. And psychologically, it's fluid. It flows towards what matters. It creates connections. It values relationships. It dissolves rigid boundaries. But too much water, you're going to be overwhelmed by emotion. You're going to lose all your boundaries. You can't separate others' feelings from your own. Too little water, you're not going to be able to feel. You're going to be disconnected. Thinking. Thinking maps to air. Air is thought, it's spirit, it's assent, it's detachment, it's clarity, the realm of ideas. The thinking function is airy. It rises above concrete reality to abstract principles. Thinking types are often described as having a clear, cool head or having the head in the clouds, right? Well, too much air, you get disconnected from the body. You get disconnected from concrete reality. You're just living in abstraction. Too little, but then you get stuck in concrete and you end up unimaginative. Sensation, earth. Earth is body, it's matter, it's grounding, it's physical presence. It's psychologically sensation. It's grounded in physical reality. It's attentive to the concrete fact. It's solid. Too much, well, materialism. You get stuck in, you can't see possibilities. You're heavy. Too little, well, then off you go again, disconnected from the body. Now, why does this matter right now at this juncture? Is that when you begin the practical work stuff, in a sense, your strength, your dominant function is your gift. You see and understand things through this function. And you can begin to see, well, what does the world look like through my dominant function? But from that, you can begin to see blind spots. You can begin to see your inferior function, where you're vulnerable, where you're underdeveloped. And this is where complexes, which we get to, hit hardest, where you're most unconscious, where you need development. And in relation to the path of individuation, wholeness requires developing all four functions. You'll never be equally strong in all. Your dominant will always be dominant as per how you developed as you grew up. But it's equally how you differ from others. When someone operates primarily through their dominant function, it's your inferior, you'll find them frustrating. They're carrying what you have not developed. So the more you understand about this and the more you look into it, the more you'll see how your place in the world has been molded. Okay. So as this kind of course begins to start, you'll start noticing, which function, just going back to those functions, which function feels most natural? Do you instinctively analyze logically? Do you respond to matters personally? Do you notice concrete details? Which function feels foreign? We will go over that even more in session 9, but there is enough now, just at the beginning, to really delve into specifically the soul mirror exercise. Okay. And one final note on this: the 4 elements in alchemy. I mentioned the alchemical connection, and I've mentioned the elements fire, water, air, earth. These map, and when we get through to the alchemy lecture, which is session 12, there'll be even more delving into the alchemical implications of if you want to see yourself as an alchemical, what the alchemical project of individuation looks like. But as we get finally kind of nearer the end, there's a few things that I have to sort of emphasize before going, here's more and more practical work, which is one, this isn't a replacement, as I've said in the intro and I've said on the course site, this is not a replacement for a therapist. And the unconscious houses some really powerful stuff, okay, that can overwhelm you, okay, you need humility, okay, this is stuff that is down for a reason, it's repressed for a reason, right? And unconscious eruptions might destabilize things, and it's a dialogue that you're having. Okay, so respect the depths of psychic forces, take a break when needs be. But that's kind of the personal ethics of inner work, that this stuff is potent stuff, but it also, what it is, there is a courage to explore yourself, and the only way out of these turbulences, these dysfunctions, if you want to see them that way, is through, and that takes a courage. So we go into the practice. So firstly, as this is the first talk, we just talk about engaging the unconscious, which is really what the process of individuation is. So if we take all of this, if the psyche is this deep, dynamic, self-regulating system, how do I work with it? I've hinted at it a little bit, but how do we establish a conscious relationship with the unconscious? Well, firstly, immediate dream journaling upon waking. Record every fragment, images, emotions, colors, sensations within 5 minutes to capture it. Do this in the present tense. Try write out the dream. I was, or even better, present, as I said, present tense. I am in a house. The windows are glowing blue, blah, blah, blah. I feel this way. Okay, Jung saw dreams as the most direct expression of the unconscious. Unlike Freud, who thought dreams disguised their meaning, sort of protecting consciousness from threatening content, Jung believed dreams reveal they're sort of the natural voice of the unconscious, speaking in its own symbolic language. You don't need to crack the code of a dream. Okay, you don't need, oh God, what does this door handle mean, right? You need to engage with it, amplify its images, let it speak to you. Okay, and this is, do this whenever you have a dream. The more you dream journal, the more you fill in your dream journal, the more it seems that people, you get into that rhythm, and the more dreams you have. For those that are struggle naturally or just don't often have dreams, magnesium. Look online for some type of magnesium that might help you get into a deeper sleep. Though, don't not a ridiculous amount, or zinc. Both will, in my own experience, that's not medical advice, but will sort of help dreams come along. It seems to be, at least. The other method here is, of course, active imagination. So if you ask someone, you know what, I don't want to do the dream thing, and you don't have to do any of these exercises, but if you don't want to do the dream thing, active imagination, deliberately engaging with unconscious figures and images. Not quite meditation, not quite free association, not quite fantasy. A dialogue that allows the unconscious to present itself in images or personifications, then consciously engaging with those presentations in sort of a half trance-like state. Equally, synchronicity, which is a bit more advanced. So later in life, Jung becomes basically fascinated by these meaningful coincidences. These are synchronicities. We're not going to focus on these practically extensively because it's easy to just veer off. But that's also something that will come up. And if you want to sort of incorporate that, jump to the synchronicity lecture. You don't have to watch all of these in order and then come back. Now, word about the ethics. Working with the unconscious isn't a game. As I've said, you're dealing with powerful forces. You shouldn't have someone to talk to. If you're really going to get down and try and map this and really do all the tasks and work, then maybe have a friend who's also interested in this thing, and you can share the course with them. I don't mind, and do it together and say, this is how I'm feeling, this is what I'm processing. But have courage. The goal is relationship. It's a conscious ego that can listen to and sort of negotiate and learn from the unconscious while maintaining itself. Okay, so we're going to get to the soul mirror in a bit, so I'll just go back one. So dream journal, as I've already said, I'm walking, present tense, I'm walking through a forest, I meet an old woman, keeps the dream alive, keeps it immediate, record everything, give each dream a title, like it's a short story is good advice, and try do that as much as you possibly can. Mapping your conscious attitude is another example. So take out your journal and spend 10, 20 minutes on these questions, which was, how would you describe yourself in a few sentences? What qualities do you most identify? Maybe something in this talk has gone, oh, actually, I never realized thinking is predominant or something like that. What do you value? What matters most to you? Your typical reactions. What do you do when you're stressed? All of the advice for this is in the work document. For each answer to these, what you want to begin questioning is yourself. So for each answer to these questions, you say, well, what's the opposite of this? Think about balance. Think about self-regulation. Think about equilibrium. What is being left out from what I've written? Have you described yourself as logical and organized? Well, where's your spontaneity? Maybe you said, I'm really easygoing. Well, why are you easygoing? What's the opposite? You're not trying to force yourself to be different. You're just noticing. Okay, and you write down these opposites. You don't judge them. You just acknowledge them. So Jung's principle, whatever you exclude from consciousness doesn't disappear. It falls into unconsciousness, where it often becomes problematic. Okay. Equally, this leads into exercise 4, which is in the workbook. Where do you feel one-sided? In relationships, in work, in emotions? Pick one area where you feel one-sided and write about it. And then ask, if my unconscious were trying to compensate for this one-sidedness, what might it be trying to bring into my life? What would balance this? Okay. Now, those are all kind of minor exercises that you can play around with, and it goes without saying. If you don't want to do the exercises, don't do them. If you want to do some, do some. Pick and choose. Read through that document first, as I said in the practice talk. And if you want to really go for it and do absolutely everyone week on week, be my guest. There is no rules to that. I don't want to apply rules, but this does bring us to the sort of something somewhat of my own invention, because so there's an exercise called Soul Mirror, or the Soul Mirror, which is found in a book by Franz Bardon called Initiation into Hermetics. It's designed initially to provide self-knowledge before mystical practice. Basically, Bardon insists you can't progress before you know yourself without self-knowledge. This exercise was designed by him to reveal your psychic structure across 3 planes of existence. Now, for him, it was your thought life. So you had your mental kind of thinking mirror, thoughts, mental habits, intellectual tendencies. Then you had your astral mirror, emotions, desires, feelings, passions. Then you had your physical mirror, body habits, physical behaviors, instincts. Each mirror, so we're going to do step 1, take these mirrors, and each you're going to draw basically a horizontal line and a vertical line, right? Mental mirror, positive, negative. Astral mirror, positive, negative. And then you list all the positive and negative aspects with regard to that specific mirror about yourself as much as you can. And what this process will look like is take a little notebook, observe yourself as if you were a stranger for 1 to 2 weeks, record all these qualities, suspend all judgment, And what you're watching for is how you think about problems, your default mental patterns, your mental habits. That would be mental. Astral would be emotional, what triggers you, your desires, moods. Okay. Physical, eating, sleep, sexual behavior, whatever it might be. You can, you'll have these huge lists. Don't worry too much about the terms, the term astral there. You could call that your feeling mirror if you so wish. That you do that for 1 or 2 weeks. You're just cataloging as many as you can find about yourself, and your negative list tends to be longer, in my experience, or mine was at least. Now, what we're then actually going to do is begin to correlate these traits. So this is where I've transformed this. So you take this initial exercise, and the instructions for just doing the first basic foundational soul mirror are in the course documents. But this is when we get to step 2, which is after 2 weeks of cataloging. And some days you'll be like, boy, I'm finding a lot about myself today. Step 2, after a couple of weeks, is you're going to correlate these to, you can kind of integrate this in a Jungian sense. So we're going to correlate all the things in that list to thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. And then, which also means correlating them to the elements. So once you've got these 3 huge lists of your positive and negative thinking, your positive and negative feeling or astral, and your positive and negative physical traits, you have a lot. You then start again with the new lists, and you say like thinking, positive, fire element, ones that relate to that. And then you eventually will have a huge list, and step 2, this will take another 2 weeks. And then the third step, so they all get correlated to an element or the thinking or one of the functions, one of the Jungian functions. And then step 3, you take all of that and you divide them all into 3, which is of importance. So directly, like ruining your life or affecting your life, partially and rarely. That will take a week. Now, that actually is the exercise in itself. Doing that exercise in itself will begin a process of balancing. It will begin that process, okay? But this is the sort of foundational undercurrent of all the practice, and drawn in with the other exercises given in the course will really bolster this self-knowledge, okay? So that is session 1, and I hope you've enjoyed. All about the self-regulating system in Jung, all about the self-regulation of the psyche, a little introduction to a split between Freud and Jung, and an introduction there to basically the practices. And then we're going to basically, in the next talks, this was the overview of the whole psyche as a self-regulating system, the architecture. We're going to just hone in on the complex, on the persona, on the anima and animus, on the shadow, and then eventually by the end, when we finish up the 10 weeks, then we're going to go into the more far out stuff, UFOs, occult, and stuff like that. So I hope that's all made sense. There is notes to read along with, and there is the work document, and you can always email me for any questions. But thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all in session 2. And of course, if you are listening on YouTube or via a podcast, this is one of 2 talks from this course that is free, that is publicly available, just as a bit of promo to say, if you enjoyed this, if you actually kind of want this kind of course that integrates Jung into how can I use this, then the links will be in the description below for where to buy the course. In my opinion, it's really not that expensive. But yeah, if it's your kind of thing, if you got something from this, then hop along and give it a look. But thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all in session 2.